Welcome to our fourth of this year's collaborations with Riot Games for Latin America. If you want to catch these guides in Spanish, then be sure to check out their channel here. Trading can be one of the most frustrating things to learn to do properly in League of Legends. At first, you'll be sitting at home watching a pro player go for a good trade, making it look super easy. You'll say to yourself, hey, I can do that, queue up for solo queue, and then fail miserably. It can be annoying not knowing what they're doing right and what you're doing wrong. Don't worry, in this guide, we're going to cover everything from the basics of trading to the advanced concepts professionals use to make trading super simple. We promise that by the end of this guide, if you apply everything we teach, you'll be out trading everyone in your games in no time. So let's jump right into it. Alright, like we said, let's kick things off with the basics of executing a proper trade. We'll cover the advanced stuff later. So, the most important rule that you need to keep in mind when it comes to trading is that it's about maximizing how much farm you get while denying as much farm as you can from your opponent. You always want to prioritize last hitting minions over trading. Now, that may sound boring, but when you realize that, you'll actually immediately become better at trading. That's because you'll become much more aware not only of when you'll be vulnerable farming, but also when your opponents might be vulnerable when they need to farm. Almost all trading is going to stem from when your opponent has to go for last hits. So the more you pay attention to that, the more opportunities you'll start to see to go in for good trades. Now, when it comes to actually trading, one of the very first things players learn is playing around enemy cooldowns. If you aren't already, then it's incredibly simple to implement. Whenever your opponent uses their ability on last hitting or trying to harass you, then you should be trying to set up a trade onto them, since they'll be missing an important part of their kit. But there happens to be an equally important cooldown that a lot of players don't punish nearly enough, and that's auto attacks. It's a different way of looking at attack speed, but basically each time your opponent auto attacks, then their attack timer goes on cooldown. Since autos are a decent source of damage during the early laning phase, initiating a trade during that small window can be a great punish against your opponent. Just be aware that the enemy missing an auto attack's worth of damage during a trade isn't quite meaningful enough that you can just win the trade based off of that alone. For example, moving up to initiate a trade against a level 7 Syndra when she auto attacks a minion might not end too well for you. Remember that the concepts we'll be covering are simply general guidelines. The effectiveness of each tip will vary depending on the matchup and stage of the game that you're in. That being said, there's a more powerful punish for when your opponent is auto-attacking minions to last hit them. Keep in mind that every champion's auto-attack has an animation and keeps them stationary for a brief moment. Whenever someone is standing still, that's the perfect time to throw a skill shot. If you're always wondering why it looks like everyone lands all their spells, but you miss all the time, then this is likely the answer. Your accuracy will skyrocket by waiting to throw your spells at this timing. This is also a great way of baiting spells out of your opponent. When you're against better players, they'll be looking to punish you each time you CS with their skill shots. If you pretend to go for one, you may bait out their ability, which will allow you to farm a bit more safely thereafter. We want to quickly point out that we're focusing on mid lane, mostly because it's the role with the most diversity in what's played. All the tips that we're going over are certainly applicable to every lane though. Kennen in top can apply the previous concept with his Q. Whenever his opponent is last hitting, he can Q and guarantee that it will land. But all of these tips might matter a bit more or less depending on the matchup you're playing. For example, auto-attacking your opponent while they last hit isn't as important in mid lane because it's mostly mages, but it's incredibly important in bot lane as auto-attacks are an ADC's most reliable source of damage. Which brings us to our next tip that's going to be the most impactful in top lane, since you'll generally find melee versus melee matchups in that lane. One of the simplest ways to get an edge over your opponent is to get a minion advantage over them. You should almost always look to fight your opponent while you have that minion lead. If they fight back and go for an extended trade, then your minions are going to heavily outdamage them, even if the matchup isn't all that great for you. Of course, you can kind of play around a minion disadvantage. If you go for a short trade against your opponent and immediately back off, then you're not actually tanking that much damage from the creeps. The reason we said this tip is more relevant for top lane is because it's much harder to go for short trades in melee lanes. In melee matchups, if you get into a trade, it's generally going to last longer than in a ranged versus ranged one. Therefore, getting minion leads and maintaining them is by far one of the most important concepts for learning how to win lane in top. Alright, so those are the basics when it comes to trading. Simply mastering those concepts is already going to make you better at trading than most players. But if you want to get even better, you'll need to learn these next concepts as well. The first thing that we need to explain is the Zone of Influence, which is the foundation for positioning properly during the laning phase. It's a pretty easy concept to understand. All of a champion's abilities and their auto attacks have a range. Each of their ranges can be represented by a circle around them. For example, Malzahar's auto attack range is 600, his E has a range of 650, his ult is 700, and his Q has a range of 900. Each of these circles represents Malzahar's Zone of Influence. In order to avoid taking any damage from Malz, you would simply have to stay outside of this range, but that's not very realistic, is it? If you were always 900 range away from Malzahar, then you'd never be able to last hit a minion, let alone win trades versus him. That's where the next step comes in, which is simply identifying the actual threat within their zone of influence. Typically, that's going to be your opponent's highest damage ability, or something that sets up their combo. In Malz's case, his highest damage ability is his E, which he maxes first. A lot of his power comes from dotting someone with it, and then resetting its duration with either his Q or R. What we're getting at is that as long as you never go into his E's 650 range, then his trading potential is incredibly lackluster. His Q and R do minor damage on their own, and his kit relies on resetting the duration of his E and setting up with his Voidlings. Understanding Zone of Influence will very easily allow you to move on to master our next concept, which is spacing. Spacing is simply standing outside of your opponent's zone, while also trying to keep them inside of your own. Take this matchup for example. Although Twisted Fate's Q has a massive range, it moves so slowly that it's incredibly easy to dodge. Therefore, his actual threat is of course from that gold card from his W, which only has a measly range of 525. On the other hand, Orianna's Q has around 900 range, so all Orianna has to do is stand outside of Twisted Fate's 525 range and within her 900. It sounds easy, but we do see a very common mistake in regards to spacing when players have an advantage though. The problem is that players often play too far back. One of the best uses of a range advantage over your opponent is to space directly outside of their zone of influence. By being right outside of their range, it puts significantly more pressure on them. For starters, you'll be denying more creeps, since they can't walk up as easily to last hit. More importantly though, you may be baiting them into thinking that they can hit you. A player can easily misjudge the range of their spells, completely wasting it, since you were never actually in range to get hit. Then you can push up even further to harass them, since their threat is even lower than before. Zone of influence and spacing might leave you wondering, wait, doesn't that just mean that the player with the range advantage wins every single lane? Well, not exactly. Remember that there's more to laning than just trading. Lux has one of the highest zone of influences in the game with her E, and yet her laning phase is considered atrocious by most professional standards. Her E has such a long cooldown early on that one of the simplest ways of beating Lux is to just push in the wave whenever she focuses on harassing you. She won't be able to stop you from doing so since her only reliable wave clear comes from that E, and then you either recall or roam while she's stuck under a tower. Of course, that's getting into the macro side of things. There are definitely ways to beat someone with a range advantage through proper trading. And for that, let's introduce Tethering, one of the main tools at your disposal for overcoming a range disadvantage. As we said, the player with that range advantage wants to harass and space out their opponent in lane, right? Well, that's when you want to start tethering. All you're doing is mirroring your opponent's movements so that you can stay outside their range of harass. If the enemy walks up, then you walk back. If he walks back, you walk up, etc, etc. It's really simple, but requires good reactions to get down perfectly. This way you completely avoid his zone of influence and you'll be taking less overall damage. Not only that, but you might condition your opponent to believe you'll do the same thing every time. At some point when they walk up, you can actually surprise them and walk up yourself. Catching people off guard this way can allow you to overcome a range disadvantage and sneak in a trade that you otherwise could never get. Tethering is incredibly useful in a variety of situations, but especially so against skill shot champions that are stopped by minions. Ahri, Zoe, and Lux type of characters are extremely susceptible to you applying tethering and always keeping a minion wave in between you and them. If you're always watching their movements, then it becomes nearly impossible for them to get a clear shot on you, which drastically lowers the threat that those champions bring to a lane. Lastly, there's one final concept that you're going to need to learn in order to trade properly, and that's input buffering. Input buffering can be used a few ways, with the most known being to guarantee certain abilities land after you flash. For example, with Twisted Fate, you want to auto-attack your target with gold card and then flash. That way, it will always go off on your target as quickly as possible. Flashing and then autoing is a bit slower since the ability isn't buffered beforehand. You can also input buffer abilities on enemies who dash into you. For example, if as Lulu, you know LeBlanc is going to dash toward you, then you can W her before she dashes and it'll go off the second she gets in range. That'll give Lulu ample time to chunk LeBlanc before she can even consider pressing either her Q or E. While these instances of input buffering are super important to know, they are not nearly as impactful as this next use. What you want to do every time you auto attack or try to land a spell on your opponent is simply to buffer your movement backwards during that animation. It sounds really simple, but it's actually extremely crucial for maximizing the efficiency of your trades. We've already gone over why spacing is so important. Very minor distances can go a long way in determining a trade's outcome. You want your character to begin moving back the second a trade is over to give your opponent as little time to fight back as possible. If you noticed, after every single Q, Camille was instantly moving backwards after the animation had finished. This gives Gnar as little time as possible to retaliate and get return damage on her. It sometimes made the difference between taking an extra auto while she walked away, which is a big reason why these trades looked so one-sided. Okay, we've gone over the foundations that you need to know in order to learn how to trade, but now let's see them all in action at once. We're going to be taking a look at a short clip from Faker, the best player of all time, to show you that there's nothing fancy that pros are doing when it comes to trading. Rather, it's just them refining the fundamentals that we've taught you here today. We're only going to watch about 30 seconds of this laning phase to see how Faker completely dismantles the enemy TF. As we said at the start of the guide, the laning phase should be about last hitting, and that's what both players focus on at the start. Faker then walks up and gets very close to TF's zone of influence. Since this is in the early game, both of them have similar zones, with TF's being 525 and Lucian's being 500. That being said, this is just a bit of fake pressure by Faker. With what we know, going for a trade here would be bad. TF still has gold card available, and if he stunned him here, Faker would be tanking a bit of minion aggro. Sometimes it's good to test your opponents. If TF got psyched out, he'd lose the melee minion for free, but he's aware enough to know that this is just a bluff. Now it's TF's turn to try and zone Faker from last hitting this minion. Let's really slow this down so you can actually appreciate what perfect spacing looks like. Faker made sure he had just enough space between him and TF to where he can turn around and auto this minion, then input buffer move backwards and still be outside his card's range. Then he initiates tethering against TF, buying time and keeping him interested while his Q comes off cooldown. Once it's up, he moves in and forces a trade to punish TF for drawing a blue card. Let's be clear, that was all in slow motion. It may not be a super fancy montage play, but that was incredibly clean. It's ridiculous how on point his spacing was during that sequence. Afterwards, TF makes a critical error. Can you actually see what it is? Take a second to think. It's very important to know the exact minion timings for when your opponent will level up. It's doubly important when a level up may change your opponent's zone of influence. With level 2, Lucian gets a dash, which enlarges his zone significantly, allowing him to punish TF for being this far up. As he chases, we can talk about one of the biggest mistakes we see from players when winning trades. It's easy to get excited that you're owning, but during each second of a trade, you have to ask yourself, if the trade started here, would I keep going? Imagine that the last 5 seconds didn't occur. The game just starts here. Do you take this trade? Knowing what you know, you should realize that it's a terrible idea to fight here. Faker may have a level lead, but he's down in ability. He may as well be level 1. Not only that, but his opponent still has his W ready. Getting stunned in this big wave is a surefire way of losing a trade, so Faker just backs off. But then Faker just applies one of the basics that we talked about. The second TF begins his auto animation, he just throws Q his way to guarantee it lands. And that is how you display mastery over someone. We could have shown you fancy plays that he makes on a daily basis, but that's not going to help you. Any professional player will always tell you that refining the fundamentals is the most consistent way of getting results and winning trades. Alright everyone, we've covered everything that you need to know to get better at trading. The rest is up to you. It's on you to apply these concepts and practice them over and over until you master them. It's all about adapting to the matchup that you're in and using the fundamentals most relevant to what you're playing against. Once you get that down, you'll be beating everyone in no time. By the way, you should know where these videos come from. Our hyper improvement platform, SkillCapped, is by far the best place to be if you want to actually improve at League of Legends. You can input your rank before signing up to see where we think you'll climb to. If you don't reach that rank while actively using SkillCapped, you can claim a full refund. That's like a gym membership guaranteeing that you'll get ripped. We offer this because our service really does work, and if it doesn't, then you shouldn't pay for it. So be sure to check us out after this. We hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next time.